Welcome to this episode of Boulder Builders podcast. Today, I'm so excited to have an amazing conversation with a friend, Tony White. Actually, I met Tony more than 10 years ago. I haven't met him in person yet. Tony has been a friend. He was on the board of a coffee company back when I was in China, a company I purchased and ran for 5 years. Tony is voluntarily giving his talent to support the company in many ways he could. Tony back then was managing over 500 franchise shops for Gloria Jean in Australia, right? So building amazing operational systems, and that's what we were trying to do. So we learned a lot from Tony, and for that, we just want to say thank you so much. It's such an honor to interview you and have an amazing conversation with you today.
Great to be with you, Justin, and it was also a great time for me to get an understanding of the China market as well through Greenhouse Coffee. So really enjoyed our time together.
Yeah. So since Gloria Jean's Coffee, you've been general manager of a minor DKL food group in Australia. And then in the last 7 years, you started your own consulting business, Tony White Consulting.
That's right.
Yeah. Is it more in the food, coffee industry?
A little bit of that, but not completely. In my own consulting business, I've been doing a lot of consulting for a range of different businesses, ranging from startups. Spent a fair bit of time in the area of renewables, helping a couple of companies get started in the renewable space. And just general consulting. I've also done a fair bit of consulting to some large listed companies as well here in Australia. And part of that, one of those projects that actually took me a couple of years, was sort of partly involved in the franchise space because it was an early learning group that had about 40 centres in Singapore, and they were wondering what to do with it. So I went up there, and what started out as a 3-month project to do a sort of a bit of a review of their business. I quickly determined that they probably needed to exit the market because the Singaporean government was sort of entering that space in a lot more aggressive manner. And so what started as a 3-month project to review ended up in a project where it sort of really was the complete reinvention of their business there. We actually bought back 20 of the franchisees. We consolidated the 20 centres that they owned and ended up selling it to a large French group. So a 3-month project turned into a 3-year project. So it was a fair chunk of my time in that. It was also involved in the franchise space.
Cool. So when we just met, you were both in the coffee industry. So since then, the the coffee industry has been growing so much, like 20% growth every year back then. But still a lot of business retail shops were not profitable actually. So I would say, even the number sounds really crazy, but I think over 80% of the retail shops in big cities and small cities in China were not profitable. And it's been actually that way even since 10 years ago. So what was your experience and interacting with the Chinese coffee business from the years?
Yeah, in Gloria Jean's, we made the mistake of looking at the China market as one market in the early days. And obviously the two standout cities that we looked at was Shanghai and Beijing. And so we thought if we could actually penetrate those two key locations, that we'd get a bit of a foothold in the market and sort of expand out from there. So we ended up with a master franchise partner. We gave them the rights to Beijing and Shanghai. They were based in Shanghai, and what we found out really quickly, in fact, this is fairly common across a lot of emerging markets, is that the groups that have influence in one city don't always have a lot of influence and networks in another. And so our partner, even though they had the rights to Beijing, which is obviously a big town, grew really strongly in Shanghai, but had no real influence and didn't really start the business in Beijing after a couple of years, even though they had obligations under the master franchise agreement to do that. What we also found out in China in those early days is it's a tough market in retail, as you rightly say. And
Right.
One of the biggest issues was for us in those early days was the rents. The rents are the killer in these markets. I mean, and I'll give you an example. In our Australian business, in coffee shops, it's all about the metrics. What are your cost of goods? What's your rent to sales? What's your labour to sales rate? In Australia, we had a labour rate to sales, which is around about the 30% mark. And our rent was somewhere around the 10 to 15% mark. So what we ended up doing, we made a mistake of replicating the same business model in a lot of emerging markets, which were relatively large footprint stores, where we tried to conserve on saving labour costs because that was the biggest pressure. But what we ended up finding in a lot of these emerging markets like China and India, which we sort of penetrated early, was that the rents really ended up coming back and bite you on the backside because they're so expensive. And so large footprint sites where you're just selling primarily coffee and not a great food offering means that you don't have the transaction value to actually cover that. So in markets like China and India, what we found was that it was completely flipped. So cost of goods was around about the same. That is, the coffee price and the rest of the consumables that go into making a coffee. But in markets like China, the labour and rent was flipped. So what we're finding was that the rent was anywhere from 25 to 30%. The labour cost was 10 to 15%, which was completely opposite. So we started out with replicating this model. You have to be very prescriptive and follow exactly what we did in Australia because that's our success model of creating these stores. We went into China, picked a partner. They did reasonably well in Shanghai, but found it was really difficult to make the business profitable. So they got to about 10 stores and then they stopped because they couldn't make the model profitably. So they stopped in Shanghai. And we had this huge market in Beijing that was untapped. They never actually entered because of this pressure with the business model. And so that was our biggest learning in markets like China, is that you really have to change the business model to actually suit the market. And that's just not the business model of how big the stores are or what you do with labour. It has to do with the product. And I'll give you an example of this as well in Australia. When we're operating the Australian business, even in one city, like Sydney, what we found was that the product that was offering in one side of the city, and most people that are sort of don't know Sydney well probably know the Bondi Beach, which is a fairly popular beach. It's very lifestyle-centred, trend-type people living there. And so the product that we offered there as far as food was largely health foods, like there were salads and wraps and these sort of things. And so, because that was what people wanted. But in the western part of Sydney, in a place like Blacktown, which is sort of lower socioeconomic, what we found was that salads and those health foods didn't do very well in those markets. Sugary donuts and these sort of things sold really well. So even within the one market, what we found was that the business model, whilst it was the same, the product often needed to change to actually fit the market. I think that's just amplified in markets like China, where you can go from one province to another and find that, the diet, the language, everything changes. And so being flexible enough to actually to change a model to suit that is really key. And the other thing we found was that in doing so, you have to really quickly identify what are your not negotiables in your brand, because there's certain things in your brand that you don't want to change. Regardless of the market, there's things like the logo, a lot of the branding, a lot of the process flows of how people enter and exit the stores and so forth, your culture. These sort of things are all not negotiable. You don't want to change. But when you go into a new market, what you really need to look at is, what's our product offer? What's our pricing? What's our business model? Should we have bigger kitchens, smaller kitchens? Do we do takeaway? Do we not do as much takeaway? Are the people coming as individuals or are they coming as groups? Because that then changes the furniture and the fit out of how you actually create a store. So a lot of these variables are within a brand, even though it's the same brand. And when you go into a store in Shanghai, you want to go into the same looking and feeling of store that's in Beijing. And I think McDonald's do this really well. McDonald's have done a phenomenal business model if you look at their brand in different markets. In a market like India, where I lived, when you walked into a McDonald's, you felt like you were in a McDonald's. That the branding was the same, the uniforms are very similar, the staff were young, the stores are set out well, the toilet facilities were clean, the service was fast, but you looked at the menu, and it was largely vegetarian. And so they had, Macaroni Tiki burgers, which were sort of potato burgers, because a large part of the market was vegetarian. It's a case of, how do I take a brand and put it into a market and then work out what's not negotiable in that brand that I don't want to change, that will be migratable from one market to the next. and how do I make everything else up for grabs that's really non-core, that really I need to actually tailor to fit that market. And I think that's the journey we went on with Gloria Jean's. And actually made in the early days of just cutting and pasting a model that works. Big format stores, largely takeaway, with a small food offering, quickly morphed into, and I'll give you an example, in Pakistan. In Australia, for example, in Gloria Jean's, 80% of our business was done before 11 a.m. So most of the business was people coming in the morning, grabbing a coffee early, grabbing a snack. And so 80% of the business was done before 11 a.m. But in Pakistan, 80% of the business was done after 9 p.m., between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m. And the reason, so therefore people weren't coming for the coffee, they were coming for a social setting, they were coming for more food and that more share food. And so it was a really interesting journey for me, sort of looking at how to take one brand into multiple markets and how to tailor that brand to actually fit that market. And markets like China was a big one. In fact, in the China market, we ended up changing our model completely, and we ended up terminating that master franchise agreement and looked at re-entering the market into much more of a sort of area development agreements for individual provinces. So, and looking at China as, I think we broke it up into 21 different areas across China rather than looking at one master franchisee that could actually do the whole lot. So yeah, interesting journey.
Yeah. Sorry. So I totally agree with what you're saying. Different market, no matter it's coffee or different industry, that can make such a huge difference. When I was running Greenhouse Coffee back then in China, that's in like a third or fourth tier city in China. Based on the tiers in China, it's like 2 million population in that little city. Coffee there's like 30, 35 per cup of coffee. With that same amount of money, you could probably buy 2 or 3 simple meals.
Yes.
I mean, a lot to do with the huge costs in China, like the real estate, the rent you mentioned. That's a big thing. Also, coffee still back then was not a huge or a hard need for a lot of people.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, labor in China was pretty cheap, actually, compared to the States. Like I said, like if you compare States and China, the States, the labor is a big cost, but the real estate, actually, the rent is not much. But in China, the rent is so high. So many coffee shops cannot really even make the revenue for the rent. And there's just, you see one coffee shop just exists for a year or two, that's pretty long already. And a lot of them cannot even last for a year, and they have to close because they don't have any cash flow anymore.
Yes.
Yeah. So even, like if you compare to the first tier cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen versus like the place where we had a greenhouse, where we're operating greenhouse, that's a different economic dynamic as well. But still, my understanding for just more outstanding of running a coffee company back then, still, I was thinking, well, this coffee business is hard to kind of survive in like the small city in China. What about, Shanghai kind of has the best shops in the retail shops, the most fancy shops in the world, right? The most expensive shops, best looking shops, product, service, and they're all amazing. They must make profitable business, but just talking to some business owners, back then years ago, I found out that a majority of the coffee shops are not making profit either. So there's a small company. They were really small, but their model was to have called a manor coffee. It was that kind of unique model. They just rent their working space, their business space is only like 5 square meters just to have one coffee setup, and just barely for 2 staff even. Yeah, so they kind of make their rent really minimal and just sell a lot of coffee every day, and they only have those locations in the very high volume business like core areas in Shanghai. So that model actually was doing much better. And yeah, then I'm glad there's a model that actually worked in Shanghai.
Yeah, I think that we call them the hole in the wall model, which is just really located in places where there's high footfall, where there's a target market, and obviously major cities where people are buying it for the luxury of buying a coffee. is really there. But you're right. I think even in cities like Shanghai, where we were, everything ratchets up. Like, the rent was cheaper in Xining, but, the volume of transactions you did was lower. The volume of transactions you do in Shanghai is larger, but the rent's larger. So the same pressures are there. And I think that I'm really convinced that the model in a lot of these emerging markets, or even markets like China, is small footprint, unless you've got very deep pockets. If you've got a small footprint store like the one you mentioned there, then at least you've got a good chance of managing the rent, the property costs. But if you've got large footprint stores, you either have to have some compelling reason that's aspirational for people to come to you beyond the product, the coffee and the food. Has to be well positioned. But if you want to scale that, you have to have very deep pockets to be able to manage that, because it's typically not going to be profitable, certainly in the early years for a franchisee. So it's a tough business, and brands like Starbucks can tough it out because they've got pretty strong partners in China as well. But then you've got local brands that are doing really quite well as well. At least on face value, they seem to be scaling. Whether they're profitable or not is another thing, but at least they're scaling quick.
Yeah. Speaking of Starbucks, that's kind of like something, the branding power make a huge difference in China. So, if you look at comparing like a big brand like a Starbucks versus a specialty coffee brand like in the greenhouse coffee back then in China, greenhouse coffee, the quality, special coffee, from the beans to roasting to the actual one cup of coffee, and the service is pretty similar. I mean, Starbucks coffee, they have a good service too in China. But just saying the product wise, back then, our greenhouse coffee, it just had provided such a much higher quality of coffee itself, right? The product is so much better. But because the customer's understanding of your quality is really very minimal about understanding about coffee, about the quality. So they don't really cannot tell the difference in coffee back then. I mean, right now, there's just more, Chinese people understand more quality differences now. But still, majority of the Chinese people cannot tell the difference. And they when they think about coffee, they, never been to a coffee shop, they will think about Starbucks, right? That's kind of a place we should go. And then we could showcase the experience at Starbucks. So that's in China. But if you look at the states, there's so many local, really fine coffee shops. Their coffee is so good, the quality is so good, and is much higher quality than Starbucks, right? So people have a large enough amount of people, the customers, that understand the difference of quality. So they don't really care about going to Starbucks, right? Yes. So that's a major difference as well in the Chinese market and in the market in the States. I was seeing that kind of similar scenario in Australia as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's like brands like Greenhouse Coffee made the same mistake that Gloria Jean's made, and that is, if I replicate a Starbucks in a market like China, and they weren't even in a major city, they were in Xining out in Western China. So, and I focus on the quality, then people will come because they like the quality of my coffee, which works well in the US, works well in Australia because it's a mature market. People understand what a good quality coffee is. So they're looking for specialty coffee, right? But 10 years ago, and even today in markets like China, you got to work out, why are people coming to Starbucks? They're probably not coming for the coffee. They're probably not coming for the food. They're coming for the aspirational value of being involved with a brand. And that is that if I go to Starbucks, then I more or less borrow the brand value that I can afford to go to Starbucks. And B, when I'm there with my friends, I have a certain social status. So the reason they're coming is not for the coffee quality. And so, brands like Greenhouse, brands like Gloria Jean's, when we entered these markets in the early days, because we were coming from a mature coffee market, we wanted to tell everybody how great our coffee is. But the market was uneducated on what a good quality coffee is. I remember in India, we did a large coffee chain, local chain there with over 1,000 stores called Cafe Coffee Day. They had awful coffee. Terrible coffee. It was Robusta coffee. It was locally grown. It was just, every time we went there, it was just awful. And our coffee quality was so much better. In our first store we opened, after a couple of months, I just did, customer feedback by going around to customers saying, what do you think of the coffee? And a lot of people say, oh, yeah, it's okay, but Cafe Coffee Day is much better quality coffee. I was sort of really surprised because what they'd been used to was Cafe Coffee Day quality coffee, and the specialty coffee came across as much stronger, much more difficult for them to consume. And so I think that in markets like China, you got to work out why people are coming to the store. And I think that I learned a great lesson from this one time, because I used to travel from India back to Australia quite often, back to the head office. I remember seeing an advertisement in Australia for BMW. It was a brand new BMW. And the picture was this guy driving along, and he was driving along. We've got a road in Australia down in Victoria called the Great Ocean Road that goes right along the coastline. And there's this guy driving this BMW, and the wings in his hair, and he's driving around these curves really fast. And the tagline was for the driving experience. So it was all about, in Australia, that same car being about, if you drive this car, it's all the experience of driving a high quality car. And then as it turned out, I went back to India that following week, and I saw exactly the same car advertised on Indian television, the BMW. And the image was of a fellow sitting in the back of a car, the same BMW with a suit on, with a driver. And he was going and looking at all the offices as he was driving past, and the tagline was "Your new corner office." Right, was the car. Brands like that really get the fact that I got the same product, but the reason and the motivation why people are buying the product is quite different. In Australia, it was all around the experience of driving. In India, it was all around the experience of being able to sit in the back of the car and to say that I've got this car. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think the same mindset needs to be. And I mentioned this earlier about going from market to market, but within markets as well. I can go to China, I can go to various different cities, and even within locations within cities. And I have to work out what is core to my brand that I want to keep here, what is non-core, so that I can actually work out and tailor it to fit that market. And if it is aspirational, which it is in China, then target all your marketing. We have to change all our marketing, all our promotions away from the quality of the coffee to just being a great place to come and with your friends, you know. So I think that being mindful of that is really important.
Yeah, it's really critical to understand the market, understand your customers, what they really care about, what they want.
Correct. Yeah. Why are they coming? And how do I get more of them to come?
Right. Yeah. So I think Greenhouse Coffee back then, I wouldn't say that's not the right direction. I was saying, I think Greenhouse wanted to kind of be almost like want to be like an Apple, you know, like one of the things that, you know, the Steve Jobs was saying, like the customers don't know what they want. We tell them what they want. I think part of it, Greenhouse back then wanted to be like that, to tell the customers, hey, this is a good coffee. But interesting, that probably there's a lot to do with the timing as well. It's like the people want to go to the Starbucks. I mean, like go to the Starbucks. They go to a coffee shop, Starbucks or Greenhouse. They want the social status. They want to show their friends that they could afford a cup of coffee, a good coffee.
Yes.
Yeah, it's quite different market. Yeah, so you know you were running the over 500, right, for 500 shops.
At our peak, we had 800 stores globally, but my primary role when I was working with Greenhouse was looking after India, Middle East, and Africa market, which at the time around about 200 stores. But eventually I ended up looking after the sort of global business and moved back to Australia. And the brand at that stage was in decline as well. So we were sort of had less stores. I didn't look after the US market. That was its own market, but the rest of them, we looked after for that, and then eventually sold the brand in 2014 to a large group here in Australia.
So back then you were running, you know, taking care of the operations over those, you know, by the peak times, 800 shops or so. And also, if I remember correctly, Gloria Jean was kind of like the major brand in Australia. Yes. And Starbucks wasn't really in a good position competing with Gloria Jean. Is that correct?
That's correct. Gloria Jean's sort of was the early part of the cycle in Australia and did exceptionally well. Starbucks came in, were going to sort of dominate the market. They grew to about 21 stores, and they made the mistake of saying if it works in America, it'll work in Australia. But they didn't change their model, which is the big lesson. So they ended up exiting the market, and Gloria Jean's grew at its peak to about 450 stores in Australia.
Well, apparently you took over the operations, the system really well, and you scaled the company in a big way. So share with us, please, about what the major things you did and the mindset behind it, or the actual, changes you made to make that successful.
Yeah, starters, it was a team, and I was part of a team that originally started. I originally started with a brand just in the Indian market because I was living in India at the time and found a master franchise partner there and sort of expanded from there. We ended up, before we sold the business, being in 42 markets, and we actually ended up nearly entering about 60 markets. We closed about 18, so we sort of penetrated a lot of markets. The model we used was a master franchise model because we recognised that it's capital light. You don't need a lot of capital to be able to do that model. And secondly, we recognise if we're going to enter another market, we need local expertise, unlike a Starbucks that potentially can enter a market and dominate the market by their own brand. So we used a master franchise model and so we'd go into a market. I'd do a fair bit of research before I went into a market to understand.
That's wise.
Yeah. And a lot of it was desk-based research. I'd do things like the CIA World Factbook, which told me a lot of. If you never looked at that, it's a really valuable resource. It tells you a lot of information about political stability, whole range of information you can glean on that market. That's number one. Number two, I do a lot of research around who are the competitors in the market. Back in the day, before we had Google Maps, I'd have to sort of put them onto a PowerPoint presentation and work out where all the stores were. So I do a whole heap of research before I entered the market. Then I typically work either with partners, broker partners, or Australian Trade Department to try and identify potential partners within that market that we could partner with. And then I'd go and visit the market. And so I'd spend some time on the ground. I do a lot of research. One of my key research strategies was to go to all the competitors' coffee shops, and I'd work out. I go there early in the morning and I get a coffee. I go there late in the evening and get a coffee, and I'd look at the receipts and typically have transaction numbers on them. And so I'd do that over the course of a week, and I'd have a pretty good understanding of the volume of transactions they were doing in the store. And I'd look around and just see what people were ordering. I'd sit in the stores for a while and work out, roughly what the average check was. And so I could, after a week or two in a market, talking to people, looking at stores, seeing who the competitors were, seeing where the gaps in the market were, I could actually create a pretty robust and fairly accurate pro forma store P&L on whether this model's going to work or not. Because at the end of the day, if your model can't work in the market, then there's no point in finding a partner and going through all that exercise. Because a lot of the times, the partners that we had weren't in the coffee industry. They were just people that were interested in entering this space, had the capital, had the operational bandwidth. And so it was our responsibility to make sure that we had a robust and profitable store model. And so a lot of that work I did before I even spoke to anyone about the opportunity. And so by the time we actually sat down with a potential partner, invariably I'd know a lot more about their market in the coffee space than what they would. And so it really positioned me to be able to be very selective in who we were looking for in a partner. And so I got fairly good towards the end of doing this, of actually working out who was the ideal partner for us to partner with in markets. And it's not always the person with the deepest pockets. I'll give you an example of one of the partners we had in India. They were a really wealthy Middle East group, and we thought this is going to be fantastic. They already had large, big box stores, retail, and we thought that they would open doors for us. They did fairly well. They opened about 20 stores themselves, and after about 2 years, the founder of that business called me over to Dubai for a meeting, and he more or less said that we've looked at this market, we've opened about 20 stores, we've invested about $12 million into this business, and we realise it's probably not for us. So we're going to exit the market. We'd like to cancel our master franchise agreement. And so for him, it was almost like a speed bump. He's almost apologising for the fact that he was entering and he was going to lose $12 million. We had another partner in South Africa who were just two really sharp entrepreneurs but didn't have very deep pockets. If they lost 100,000, that was the end of the world for them, right? It's how do you find the right partner in a market? And this could be either a local franchisee, it could be a master franchisee, it could be an area franchisee. how do you define the type of partner that you want? And I think that's really important before you go into a market, is to say the profile of the person that we're looking for needs to have these capability attributes.
Right.
That is, they know how they're strong in the market. They probably created another brand. They already understand the nuances of the market. They do have some capital, but not too much capital that, if they lost it, it wouldn't be a big deal. Not too little capital that if they have a setback, that they're going to go out of business. So there's all these attributes that we look for in a potential partner. And then, of course, the other part was the character attributes. And so what we ended up doing is a lot of ground-based research, identifying the partner. Then once we identified the partner, I'd get them to do a whole bunch of work on the ground of creating a model, creating a business plan, all these sort of things. Then the very last piece is that we'd invite them down to our head office in Australia. We had a very visionary executive chairman and owner of the business. And he insisted that every partner come down to Australia so that they could firstly see the brand in its fullness with the number of stores that we had, meet the team that they were going to be interacting with, and then sit down and hear the vision, mission, and values of what the business was about. And the owner of the business was a very committed Christian guy. And part of the exercise for him was that it's an interesting story, actually, his vision, because before he opened one store, he believes that God gave him a vision for the business.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote it out on a piece of paper, what that vision was, before he even opened one store. And when he took on the rights because Gloria Jean was an US brand, he took on the rights for that. He just followed that vision that God had revealed to him, and he'd written on this one-page plan. And he went through a lot of setbacks and all the rest of it, but he stuck with his plans. What ended up happening was that every person that came down would do 3 days of the tours, meeting the people, looking at our roasting plant, looking at our stores, speaking to our franchisees, speaking to our support team. And then the last meeting was with the executive chairman, the founder, in the boardroom with our partner. And so by this time, they already understood all about the business. They understood their own model. They'd met all the team, all these sort of things. So they were more or less sold before they got to this. Then he'd sit down with them and he'd say, what I want to do is I want to read you my vision. And he'd go back to this one-page vision and he'd read it line by line. He says, Gloria Jean's will be the most trusted and respected brand. Then he'd unpack what that would mean to him.
Yeah.
And Gloria Jean's, we give all the glory to God. And he'd unpack what that meant to them. And a lot of these partners were not Christians. Obviously, they're coming from places like the Middle East and India and China and so forth. And at the end of that vision, he would then say to them, so it would take about 2 hours for him to go through that one page, because he'd unpack each line. At the end of it, he'd say, so that's who we are. He says, here's the question I've got for you. He says, do you want to put the ring on? Because for me, we're going to be married. We're going to be married for a long time. So the question is, do you want to put the ring on?
Yeah, yeah.
In other words, do you buy into these values? And every time someone would say, yeah, absolutely. Because people are compelled by people who have a vision for where they want to take the brand. They want to be a part of something that's bigger than themselves. And I think this was the really compelling part of how we expanded quite quickly. A lot of it was in the quality of the people we had, the quality of the brand, the amount of research we did. But the foundation that really underpinned it was this unwavering vision towards having something that you believe in.
Yeah.
But you really believe in it enough that you actually try and put it right through your company, right through your brand, and communicate that to incoming partners so they're really clear on who you are and what your expectations of how they would handle the brand. So I think that was a big part of my learnings from that time, is that how do you do the work? Because you've got to do the work to actually understand the market and all the rest of it. But that's just part of it. The other part is the quality of the people that are attracted by a vision that's much larger than themselves. And I think that was, if I was to interview a lot of the partners at that time, it was that piece that was the piece that wanted them to be a part of it rather than having to sell them to be a part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. The why behind why you even work on it, why you started this business is very critical. It's a foundation of, a successful business. That might take a long time, but it got to see, your vision, where you want to be at, and that could, and then you make plans for, on the process, in the process. and having guiding principles to make it happen, values to support it. And yeah, so I believe, like the partner you mentioned, and then this you just mentioned, it is very critical. A lot of your shops are franchise shops as well, right? Like you're helping Greenhouse to kind of expand or scale that franchising system as well. Greenhouse, the franchisees, there some are amazing, and especially those who understand your vision, understand the values. There are some American franchisees as well in Ningxia, another place in China. Yeah, we kind of value aligned. They're so supportive of what you're doing. Just communication is just amazing.
Yes.
Yeah, but there's some franchisees that, well, they don't understand the vision, or they don't care so much about why you're doing this. And also there's some franchisees even having integrity issues, not paying their payables.
Yes.
And refuse to pay payables, not refuse to perform the contract, saying, contract does not mean anything in China, things like that. So just that's something I learned as well, which I didn't learn before.
I think that gets back to, even if you actually, you mentioned about the why and having that foundation, and it's a real challenge, because the quicker you scale, you're not always going to find those ideal people that you're talking about. You're going to find people that are probably more enamored by the opportunity. And the temptation is to compromise your why, to compromise, the sort of the attributes that you're looking for in a franchisee, and therefore just taking it because you either got a lease on a property, or you want to grow into a city and you want to grow fast. So whoever's available, you take. In fact, there's a franchise plan around that says that as long as someone's got a pulse in the checkbook, they can become our franchisee. And I think that that's a bad strategy. End of the day. How do you keep the line of actually trying to be really clear on the type of people that you're looking for and trying to manage that franchise network? Because if you got, like in Australia, we had 450 franchisees, and a lot of them didn't buy in because of the vision, mission, and values. They bought in because they wanted to be in the coffee space, right? And you're going to inevitably find people that don't subscribe to your vision or your values. And I think the question then becomes, how do you deal with those people as a franchisor is the challenge. How do you deal with them with full respect and love, and at the same time not tolerate certain things that are going to damage your brand? So it's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah. So, you were supporting Greenhouse in many ways and sharing your experience, help Greenhouse to try to help Greenhouse to be successful. Even though that was, when I was running it, it was after I purchased the company, I suffered a lot running the business. But you're giving a lot to help, to support. So share with us about the motivation, the why behind it.
Yeah, well, I really love the fact that Samuel, who originally started Greenhouse Coffee, had a vision. I seem to be attracted by people who have strong vision, had a strong vision of wanting to go into Western China and set up sort of a quality coffee brand, a specialty coffee brand. If you ask me, I think he was probably 10 years too early. The right strategy, the right brand, wrong time. And which is okay. You mentioned before, as long as people have the education, then you're fine. But if you have to have fairly deep pockets to be able to have the runway to educate people to your brand. So I think the thing that really attracted me was his vision. He was quite passionate, enthusiastic. I liked the boldness of the fact that he was starting where he was starting, and just saw a great opportunity, because, they're ultimately roasting their own coffee as well. So I thought, this is incredible. Like, we're doing it for 800 stores, which is one thing. We had a massive roasting plant in Australia that supplied all their coffee. But, he was doing it for a couple of stores. So I thought that was pretty bold and pretty brazen. And so I was sort of really attracted by that. I was attracted by their vision. I was attracted by their faith as well, to just sort of say, I want to step out and do something quite different in a location. And so that's why I was really committed when you took over the business, just to continue on with that, just to try and see how can we make this as much as possible to be successful. And so that was my main motivation.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I and my family really appreciated your help back then. So I did, honestly, I suffer a lot, even though I feel like that was taking over Greenhouse, purchased a company and running it for 5 years. That was totally God's plan, and I obeyed, God's guidance and took over the business. I thought it would be easy, because I thought, well, that's such a small business, even though that's kind of significant, like a foreigner-owned business in local city. But I was thinking, well, there's such a small business, and I've seen so many case studies in the business school, right, in the States, and encountered, big companies while I was working in the States and China. So I thought running a small coffee business would be easy, but it wasn't the case. So that was a very, very hands-on experience, very hands-on, very valuable, like a business school education.
Yes.
Out of school.
An MBA.
Yeah. But because I followed God's steps and God's guidance and God's lead, I obeyed Him. Even though that was a really hard time, one of the hardest times to in my life, actually. It just many nights I couldn't sleep well because kept thinking of the business, how to make it work. But that the whole process really humbled me a lot. I learned so much from it, and I feel like I wouldn't trade that experience for anything.
Yeah,
that experience made kind of like shaped me who I am today, making me a much more like humble person, and actually help me understand myself better, see more of myself, and also actually gained a closer relationship with God.
Yes.
It just that I had so much opportunities to kind of dialogue with God and ask for help, ask for wisdom, even though, eventually I couldn't continue. I feel like that was the time I need to let it go, to work on something else, sell the business to one of the franchisees. Actually, I believe she's doing a better job than me in operations. So from the beginning to the end, I thought that was such a valuable experience. And
yeah, well, it's good on you for being vulnerable enough to admit the fact that you struggle with it, because a lot of people find reasons why other people outside of themselves as to why they struggled. Mm-hmm. I really respect the fact that you acknowledge that it was a difficult time, because it's true, business is pretty tough, and if we knew what was awaiting us before we went into it, we probably wouldn't go into it. But once we're in it, we've got no choice but to deal with it, and I think that's where really the growth comes. Mm-hmm. They always say that discomfort always precedes growth, and one of the things that I found in life is that when God calls you to something, that He doesn't always call you to something that's a success in the world's eyes, but what He does call you to is obedience, and He actually is there with you and actually teaching you as you go. And obviously that's your testimony. As you're saying, you wouldn't have it back. You probably don't want it repeated, but you probably wouldn't take it away, because it's made you the person that you are today. And I think that's a real key in our walk with God, is that how do we look at situations that have been tough challenges in our life and look at the fingerprints of God that have been upon it, and what have we learned from it, so that we can either go forward and be really learn from it, or we can be bitter and disappointed and be trapped and imprisoned by it for the rest of our life. And so I think that's really a real takeaway that I've actually experienced, because I've had quite a few different failures in my own life and businesses. I had one where I got left with a huge amount of debt. In fact, it was similar to you. It was the closest time I've ever been to God. In fact, I think that it was in our early marriage we had 2 children, and we had no money and no food, which is bizarre in a place like Australia. We had no money, no food. And one day we were cleaning out the shed, and we were cleaning up some old boxes, and we found a card, and inside it was a $10 note, which to me was sort of like, which we'd never opened, that card. And it just was, again, those little bits that you can cling on to, that were probably our closest time in our walk with God, were the difficult times. And do we want to go back there and repeat them again? No. Do I thirst for that walk with God in more intimacy? Yes. And I think that's really the challenge for me at the moment, is how do I walk with God where I don't have immediate challenges and depend upon Him regardless of the circumstances. And I think that's really the sort of really. What was probably the biggest lesson you learned out of that time then? those 5 years at Greenhouse? What was the biggest takeaway that you had?
Sorry, what was the biggest? Sorry, what?
What was the biggest lesson that you've learned from the time that you had at Greenhouse?
I learned several things. Well, in a macro setting, I just learned so much about running a business in general in China. I had encountered with some entrepreneurs in the States before moving back to China from California. Their story is quite different than what I experienced in China running Greenhouse. So I kind of have the first, really hands-on experience running a small business in China. So it's good to learn that. I feel like, I would say that, I don't know if it's the lessons or it's just something I just got to get to know more, I know the labor relationship, not labor, just the kind of the working relationship with your staff. It was pretty new to me as well, because I was working, in some small medium business in China, in the States, and a large, bank in China, and then switching to Greenhouse, I could see the quality of the staff. So I had to adjust that. That was pretty challenging as well. Sometimes you feel like the people in the position would do their job, but eventually I learned that they don't necessarily do the job and do the job well, and that make it really hard on my job, because I need a great system. I need everybody perform what they're supposed to do, and then that for that part I really struggle a lot. The best banks in China, they probably could recruit the best talents in China.
Yes.
If you work even you own a coffee shop in the coffee company in the States, the staff quality, the job they perform, there's some people that are pretty off. They don't show up for work. They are late all the time. But that's not the majority of the case in the States. The work ethic, it's pretty satisfying. Just hearing the stories and working the small business in the States. But in China, the staff don't show up for like 2 hours and nobody open the store. Even that happens. That was kind of surprising to me. And I know there's Samuel may share some stories. Like there's some staff that have pretty low educational level, and they couldn't even do the pretty basic math. That's kind of surprising to me as well. Maybe there's some gap in between the northwest part of China and then the east part of China. But anyway, so it's just a lot to absorb, and taking on that business. I also learned about the government relationships, even to small business. There's some surprising things that you have to deal with in running a business, which one you'll never encounter, as an entrepreneur in the States. For that part, I would say American entrepreneurs, they're very blessed. You have a very supportive system, even though country like Australia or United States are not perfect. There's issues to be solved. There's always room for improvement. We want a more transparent government, like spending, like what Elon Musk is doing. But still, this country actually provide a lot of opportunities. I believe Australia's too, for you just to focus on the business instead of concerning about some government relationships. Yeah,
it's a full-time.
And also, I feel like I
kind
of overestimated. I was very optimistic about the Chinese economy back then, about the Chinese the economy on that province and the coffee industry. My understanding or my research on that industry wasn't so accurate. So I think I should have a better evaluation of that industry and have a more realistic goals or expectations on taking that company right after taking on the company. So I just got to know so much about the whole country, the local economy, the coffee economy, the team building, the company management, HR management, financial management. It just that gave me a holistic experience running a business in China.
You're on the fast track.
Huh?
Fast track of learning there for sure.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. It's such a really invaluable experience for me.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that gave me a lot of encouragement. Nowadays that because that experience that gave me more confidence in what I'm doing right now in those even that's not unrelated fields like oil and gas,
Yes.
private credit. And private credit, I have some experience in China, but there's even though that's not related, those experience, even though I feel like I almost failed the business, I could even say that. I mean, I don't even feel bad saying, hey, I failed that business. I didn't scale that business. I didn't manage the business well enough. But there's nothing, of integrity issue, right? It just to me, it's just my capability, my capability, or my understanding of that industry wasn't sufficient, or whatever. So I'm proud of doing what I did for the whole process, and I wouldn't, yeah, like I said, I wouldn't be who I am today without that experience. Yeah.
It's much better to have a capability gap than an integrity gap.
Yeah, some people don't want to admit that, oh, I feel that I didn't develop that business well enough because I was not capable enough. I'm fine with saying that. I wasn't, back then I wasn't so good at that job, and I'm okay with it. And okay, I see that was what I did. That was who I was, and I'm better than 5 years ago. I was better than 8 years ago when I was running greenhouse. Now I'm getting 30%, 25% returns to my investors through oil and gas, and I vet for those. For my investors, I feel like I'm so much more successful in those investments. And I also understand that also what I learned is that I'm not so great at operations. And it's good to know that there's certain areas you're not good at, and it's okay. And sometimes you have to be good at some areas, but sometimes you have to figure out if there's something, if that's not area you're good at, you want to outsource it, or if there's something that you don't want to take care of, you don't want to be responsible for, then work on something that just could make your strength shine.
Yeah. It sounds like you're doing that now. If you're getting 25% return, it sounds like oil and gas, much bigger industry, is probably a lot more easier than
I definitely enjoy what I'm doing right now much better. It's just understanding the macroeconomics, and then understanding the industry, and then find the best, heavyweight person in that industry to work with, as the one that GP is to work with you, to work on the project, to work on the investments. I think doing my job and not taking care of the whole thing, not taking care of operations, I don't have to know how to, mine the oil and gas. I don't have to do the underwriting in the private credit fund as well. So I think I'm glad that, God's leading me to where I am today, and just glory to Him.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot to explore. There's a lot to, looking forward to. But I just want to say, God is good all the time, and like God called me to go to the business. Like I said, I think there's also some misunderstanding among the Christian group as well, and it's because sometimes you feel like God made it so clear to you to take off something that this thing must be smooth. This must be like having financial huge profit. I mean, it does happen many times, but it's not always the case. But when it's not always the case, you have to be okay with it, and then still give thanks to God, knowing that your God is letting you go through some amazing experience that's super valuable. You will realize later on, maybe in a couple of years, in several years.
I heard a message sermon a couple of weeks ago where the guy mentioned that God's love language is obedience. And I think that's so true. I think that He doesn't necessarily always reward success, but he does love people that hear His voice and step out and follow His leading, and leave the rest to Him. It sounds to me, in hindsight, and I think that sometimes with these things you can only see them in the rear vision mirror. When you're going through them, you're not enjoying them. But when you go through it and look back and just see what, yes, I can be vulnerable enough and transparent enough to say that I didn't do the capability gap in that, but I was still obedient. I did what I thought was right at the time. And so I went back now, I'd probably do things differently, but at the time that was what it was, and I've learned, and it's who I am today. And I think that mindset of being available to step out into areas where you're uncomfortable, and typically what I find is God leads you into areas that you're uncomfortable in. Because that requires faith, it requires obedience, it requires the ability to say that I can't do this on my own, but I'm doing it anyway. And I think that, sometimes, as you rightly say, they work out successful in the world's eyes, and sometimes they work out as failures in the world's eyes, but at the end of the day, it's our choice to determine what that looks like for us. So I think that, as I said, if it's about, can I be comfortable with the fact that I was obedient to what God told me to do, then that's it. That to me is success.
Yeah. So even the hardest time when I was struggling, it was super challenging, the business, greenhouse, running greenhouse. So, my wife knows the whole process, why I took it, how God spoke to me through dreams or miracles, whatever, to make it extremely clear for me to purchase greenhouse. So in the hardest time, my wife was asking me, I said, like, I really want to quit, to give it up. My wife was saying, if you go back to, several years ago, a couple of years ago, would you still make the move? Would you still, follow God's lead and, obey to God to take over the business? I said, I would, just because God speak to me so clearly. Yeah.
I look forward to what he's going to speak to you about next. And obviously oil and gas is working pretty well for you. So
Yeah. Those investments are working really well, sending distributions a year ahead of schedule. So investors are happy. Right now, I'm just trying to, so do more capital raise for another round of oil and gas and private credit fund. And I'm trying to go into real estate as well. There's a group in Colorado locally, in the States as well. There's called a redemptive real estate. That's something I'm really I'm really excited about. It's just a group of Christian investors, fund managers trying to make some projects happen, build large projects, and work with Apartment Life to reach out to this building, 500 families, having community events, movie night, pizza night, share about Jesus. So reaching out to this building, to this community, be part of the community. I'm super excited about it.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome.
Yeah.
We look forward to seeing what happens in that one.
Yeah. Cool. So thank you for such an amazing conversation.
Thank you, Justin. Really appreciate it, and great to connect back with you again after what must be about 10 years. So
yeah,
it's great.
I know you have such a rich experience in what you did in the retail franchising system, scaling business, especially in the retail space. I'm sure there's other industries or some other models I'm not aware of, but you have your consulting business, right? If people in the whole world have a need for your service, how can people find you?
Yeah, they can contact me. They can contact me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, or my website is avwbusinessconsulting.com. Or you can get there as well as tonywhite.au as well. And there's a fair bit on my website there of what I do and how you can make contact with me. But if anyone needs any help, I'm always here to give some assistance and see where I can help, similar to what I do with Greenhouse, just to help them on their journey. A lot of people have helped me, and I think that that's part of the value that I want to provide moving forward to people that want to go to places where I've been, but don't know how to get there. I think that's really the key.
Cool. Hey, I will make sure I'll put your contact information in the link below. Yeah. Again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for this really pleasant conversation.
Excellent. Thanks, Justin.
And thank you for your help again.
Yeah, no.
For supporting business in China.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. My pleasure indeed. I learned a lot through that as well. So it was reciprocal both ways.
Cool. All right. God bless you.
Thank you. You too. See you, Justin. Bye-bye.